we will have now, I hope, a very interesting discussion. I mean, I think you've seen and heard, we've had three very different takes on the crisis of globalization. If I could very, very quickly summarize the first one looking at the blockages to development, the second looking at the idea of reshoring and the idea that globalization to some extent, at least at the moment, seems to have come to an end or gone into reverse in terms of global value chains. And the third presentation looking at the crisis of globalization in terms of the link between, this is my interpretation, globalization and the shift from, let's say, positive political liberalism towards a more, towards an economic neoliberalism which requires a very different normative view. That would be my attempt to put a package around these three presentations. So again, please quickly say who you are, and you probably, in this case, also best make clear who your question is addressed to, and do please try and be brief. And I'll take perhaps 3 or 4 questions. Let me take the lady here, and then I'll take Tom Pally, then I'll take Özlem and Wendy, and that's 4 for now.
Hello, my name is Sophie Rotermund. I'm a student at the Hansjörg Herr currently, and I have a question for Professor Marin. If I understood you correctly, you were saying that high-skilled labor is the primary loser of the robotization. And I'm wondering, what about the unskilled labor? Because especially we're seeing a lot of automated driving or delivery, so on, automatic production. What about those drivers, like anybody in transportation or in the assembly line workers? So, because the argument, as I know, is that these people regularly then would have to take up jobs such as like coordinative tasks. So that kind of means that they have to take jobs that are then higher, like for higher skilled people regularly. How I understand that, it's kind of a contradiction for me to your argument that high skilled labor are the losers. So yeah, my question is, what about the not so high skilled laborers? And yeah, is that a contradiction?
Tom Pally. I have a quick question for Hansjörg and then one for Sam Bowles. Hansjörg, I liked your talk a lot, and I liked your list of problems that were preventing development, but I didn't see on your list one called political failure in developing countries. Do you think it is a problem? Do you have any solution to it? And maybe do the policies that you talk about recommend? Might they make it worse, or would they improve it? And my question for Sam is, well, I liked your conclusions very much, but I find myself very much at odds with your history. My understanding, at least of British history, is that liberalism failed in the late 19th century and early 20th century. We all used to talk about the failure of Victorian capitalism and the social question, that in turn then came the Great Depression. So the response was social democracy, and we should not be talking about liberalism's perfect storm. We should be talking about social democracy's perfect storm. And why do we have this crisis of social democracy? My answer could be, in fact, because we've tried to take ourselves back to the liberalism of the 19th century, which is the Democratic Party of Bill and Hillary Clinton. Thank you.
Okay. Tom, can you pass to Özlem here? Yeah. And then Wendy. And then I'll take some colleagues later at the back there. Here.
Thank you very much. Özlem Onaran, University of Greenwich. I have 2 questions to Dahlia. Quite a few of us have been presenting papers at this conference about the causes of falling wage share and rising inequality. And we do admit the role of technological change, in particular ICT technology. We look at globalization, but of 3 of the things that are being spotted out in this research of the fellows of this group of researchers is financialization, welfare state retrenchment, and the decline in the collective voice of working people, things like declining collective bargaining coverage, union power, and so on. So what do you think about that? You have talked a lot about robotization versus globalization, but there is that. And the second is, you seem to say it's a problem for labor. I can see that. But what about the capitalists? Is that not a problem for them? And my reflection is Henry Ford II's conversation with Walter Reuther, the trade union leader, in 1950s. Ford showing his sort of pre-robots to the union leader and says, Walter, how are you going to get these machines to your union? And Walter is a very intelligent man, and he says, how are you get them by your goods, Henry? So is that not a problem?
Wendy Carlin, UCL. So my question is to Dahlia. Dahlia, you're really popular for questions. Okay, so the question relates to what might be called German exceptionalism, which I thought came through very clearly from your talk. One element that you didn't have a chart for was showing the comparative unemployment rates, and so we could have added extremely low unemployment in Germany relative to a number of other European countries. The ones you mentioned were successful reshoring and the successful redeployment of value chains in Eastern Europe by German companies. And the third was the element of exceptionalism was in relation to the educational premium and the supply, the weaker supply of higher education. Okay, so these came out very strikingly from what you said, and I wanted your response in terms of, well, do you agree that there is something that might be identified as German exceptionalism? Does this have to do with specific institutional arrangements in Germany within firms, and this relates to a theme in Sam's talk? For example, the role of works councils. Does the specific German training system and the more equal status accorded to vocational education speak to this question about the overemphasis on higher education in other European countries? So, in other words, are the robots somehow able to be accommodated because of these rather specific German-type institutions?
Thanks very much. I take the gentleman at the back here, and then Mark, and then I would have a second round. I've already noted some. I noticed Yusa and the young man here.
Hello, Rafael Wildauer, University of Greenwich. I have a question to Samuel Bowles. I didn't understand your last slide, your conclusions. If I understood it, or the way I understood it was you said, okay, it's not about trying to make an argument about why unregulated markets don't work. We need to make a convincing argument why we need collective action. To me, that sounded like a nuance. I don't see why you. To me, I don't see why you claim that this is such a big difference. Maybe could you elaborate a bit on that? Thanks.
Yes, I'm Marc Lavoie from the University of Paris 13. I have a comment to Sam Bowles. I was a bit struck by his presentation. The claim, I mean, the way I understood, if I can summarize, is that there was this golden age where liberalism was great and where there was no xenophobia. And now, since 1973, there's been this evolution where suddenly all of us, or many of us, have become xenophobic. I find this a little bit ironic. I mean, in which country are we right now? And what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s? I mean, there were 6 million Jews that were killed during the Holocaust. Was that really the best period of liberalism?
Okay, I've noted some other names, but I think we need to go back to the panel. I'll possibly take them in reverse order. Sam, would you like to?
To the last question, I think you must understand, I was not suggesting there was a golden age of fascist liberalism. We're not talking about a liberal country that did that. And the idea, I didn't hear anything about golden ages, actually, in my talk. You know the history well, as do I. I was talking about a liberal tradition, one which I admire, and I hope you do as well. The political tradition of liberalism is something on which we all depended. The existence of our very jobs, the ability to have conferences like this, and so on, is part of it. So there was no golden age in my talk. I don't worry about that. But I am talking about a threat to those values today, which is rather strong. It's been strong in the past, and it's strong now. It was not strong during other periods. And we don't have major political movements overtaking countries which were once reliably liberal, and now we wonder. I worry about that a lot. I hope you do too. The last slide, what I'm worried about is this. Leftist economists like myself spend a lot of our time saying markets don't work very well. That's true. Unregulated markets don't work very well. We cannot defeat the right by showing that. The reason is their big victory in the last 3 decades was not to show that markets don't work very well. That's been pretty well understood for a long time. And it's being demonstrated again and again for climate change reasons and so on, as it was during the Great Depression. Their big success was to show however poorly markets work, well or poorly, the government works worse. That's what they won. That's the new thing they won. That's their hegemony today. And of course, I mean, we're very good at showing why markets don't work. I don't think we have a whole lot of opposition about that, not academically, not scientifically. That's a battle that has to be fought. If I suggested it was won, of course we haven't won it. I think we probably have won it more or less within the economics profession and the other fields. But I think rescuing the idea of democratic collective action, including a democratic state, as an effective interest on behalf of all of us and the common we that we share, that's really important and something which we haven't won. Tom, going back to 19th century liberalism, notice I was talking about the liberal tradition in politics and philosophy. And of course, it adjusted in the actually early 20th century to the demands of working class people and others, former soldiers, many of them, to become democratic. I don't think that was a failure of liberalism. Then it became, as I said, eventually social democratic. That was, I think, today the most viable vehicle for the advance and the survival of those values which I hold dear. So this is not a question of saying the perfect storm of social democracy. It is the perfect storm of a set of values that's very important. Social democracy is its best hope, and I thought I said that.
Thank you very much. Dahlia?
Yeah, okay. I come back to your question about other high-skilled people, the losers. We all talk about driverless cars, but you see, the driverless cars are not yet implemented. We're only talking about them. They're not yet on the streets. So we do, I'm not saying that they are not low-skilled workers also replaced by machines. I mean, we know if you go to the airport, you don't have a person anymore. You check in by yourself with a machine. So this is replacing people and not particular high-skilled people. I'm not saying that, but I do believe that the new feature of this technology is that it replaces brains. And these are the high-skilled people. And yes, this is what I want to push. And we do have evidence that. So the reason why this is important is actually because governments try to push education as a remedy for globalization and roboterization. And what I want to suggest is that you should be a little skeptical about that as a solution. It might mean that we are moving in a direction as it used to be in the former planned economies. You know, in the former planned economies, the educated people, this was the norm. Everybody was educated. But the educated people, primarily women, had not the highest standing in society. They didn't earn the highest income. Actually, the worker, the skilled worker was earning the highest income. So maybe what we are going to face is a future in which people are educated, but they are not earning the highest income. In the past, it was the case that education gives you the higher income. It's still true. I'm not saying that we are already there, because it's still true that higher education reduces your probability of getting unemployed. you know. So a skilled person has a 50% less chance of being unemployed compared to, the average of the population. This is still true, but it might not be true in the future. So that's what I'm saying. I come to the second question, which was, what explains the decline in the labor share? Is it really only the robots? I'm not claiming that the robots are the only driver. Actually, in this paper that I was citing, it's 50% of the decline, so it's not all. I'm sure the decline in trade unions is a major driver in this. And what I also think, and we have now new papers that show this, is actually that we have an increase in monopolization, an increase in the concentration ratios that has been contributing to the decline in the labor share. So, and basically this is also a response to digitalization, basically, because the increase in concentration ratio is basically a response to network industries. If you think about Apple, for instance, or Facebook, Facebook is a better example, or Amazon. I mean, these are network firms. Their output is more valuable the more people use this output, okay? So your Facebook network is more valuable the more people use it. And so that makes firms grow very fast. And so these online platform firms, basically, they have the cost of implementing a platform. But once this platform is installed, they can expand without adding labor. So basically, these firms grow very quickly, without adding labor. So that contributes also to this increase in concentration ratio, the increase in the importance of these network firms relative to the other firms in the economy, contributes to the decline in the labor share, which I think is an important driver of this too. And lastly, the German exceptionalism. I think there is something about the German exceptionalism. First of all, as I showed in the numbers, the expansion of higher education was much less than in other countries. This is one point, so that's one of the reasons why the unemployment rate among the skilled workers is practically not present. It is present in some way, because what happens is basically that the students with a bachelor degree, they now do the work of somebody who had a high school degree, and they complain now in Germany that the bachelor, which was a new introduced academic degree, is not accepted in the economy. But it's not true, it's not accepted. It's just another way. So who gets unemployed is now the high school worker, not the university worker. But there is something to the German exceptionalism, and it's something different than what you may have in mind, which is that in Germany, you know, the United States suffered a terrible China shock. We now have evidence that the China shock actually has contributed to an increase in unemployment, in lower wages. And so it was very hard for workers to move from those industries which lost due to the Chinese import competition to find a new job. So they were hard hits. Now in Germany we didn't have that. And the reason why we didn't have that, part of the reason why we didn't have that is because of Eastern Europe, actually. The expansion of Eastern Europe played a big role because basically Germany benefited very much from Eastern Europe. It expanded its production networks to Eastern Europe, and that helped German firms to increase their market shares in world markets so they could expand their employment. So we didn't have that unemployment effect as in the United States. Yes. The vocational education, you know, I'm a little bit more skeptical because, you know, in times of rapid technical change, if you have a specialized vocational training, it might be outdated after 10 years because, so it's maybe better to move to the American system in which you have a general education, and this general education might help you to adjust better to new circumstances in which might arise in the future. But this is something up to debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, of course, you're completely right. We can have, and we find also a lot of policy failures in developing countries themselves. So I think, and I think there are two dimensions. They can follow the wrong policies because they have the wrong model in mind, and so we have this kind of failure. But I think it's even more important. The elites in many developing countries are very much linked to the living style and probably the elites in the developed world, as was mentioned yesterday, that the world may move in such a direction. And if you have elites which are relatively rich, with a relatively good life, already belonging to the world middle class, then we have probably not much interest to really start a development project, because that could, at least for medium term, reduce the living standard and reduce the freedom, for example, to invest the money where they want. So that's an additional point why it's so difficult probably to develop these countries. And maybe one sentence to your talk. I mean, if you're right, if you have reshoring, then this problem of premature deindustrialization becomes even more pressing. Then probably we would have the developed world, we would have some countries that make it, China, etc., and many countries are not needed for industrial production, yeah, and then they end up in a mess.
Okay, thank you. So we can have a second round. I've noted most of you, at least at the front, I've noted you, the lady here has the microphone, so why don't you make your question? I didn't have you quite first, but that's okay.
My name is Ludmila. I'm from the Global Institute for IT Management, and please allow me just 30 seconds. First of all, thank you to organizers. I mean, to bring all these people together is just brilliant work. Thank you so much. The most beautiful... The most beautiful and powerful phrase that I heard at this, in this three presentation is the following: technologically dynamic and cosmopolitan economy. Thank you so much. I suggest that you take this, like the theme, the main subject for your next year conference, because this is exactly what everybody would benefit from and what everybody would appreciate. And the most dangerous phrase was German exceptionalism. I mean, truly. And thank you so very much, Dr. Marin. And I would like to, from all my heart, I would like to congratulate you all for just hearing one of the best presentations I personally heard in Berlin in the last 3 years. And this is Dr. Marin?
Yes.
Yes. Because
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Laura, the young lady in the pink scarf. Yes, could you give her the microphone? And then afterwards, you can give it to the gentleman on your left.
My question will go to Professor Marin. Thank you for your speech. About your argument that education may not be the... Okay. About your argument that education may not be the solution, I wonder whether the increase of higher education isn't exactly the social answer for this issue. Once it delays the entrance of workers in the labor market. In other words, the increase of higher education may not be the individual answer to increase income, but socially speaking, decreasing the social working hours may lead to a better balance between workers and capital owners. That's my question.
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone to the gentleman? Yeah.
I wanted to second the thanks that were just expressed, but I also want to, at the same time, make a very, very strong plea for next year's conference or conferences in the next few years, that this group of economists, and I found extremely interesting panels and lectures and so on, should put more attention to the question of the ecological collapse or the ecological problems that the global economy faces. It seems to me that that is possibly the most threatening aspect of globalization, and it behooves us, particularly because there were so many young economists who came to this conference to put more emphasis on one of the major themes that needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. That's a fair point. We have dealt with that issue in the past, I must say. Antonella, you... No, sorry.
Thank you. Just a quick remark about the declining wage premium for higher education in European countries, because I suppose, I'm not sure, but you will know, that the greatest majority of highly educated people in Europe works in the public sector. So the decline in the premium might very well be an institutional factor related to the, wish to keep in check public expenditure and, this kind of things.
Thank you. I have Heike next. And then you. I didn't actually have you on my list, so oops, you.
But he's got the microphone.
Yeah. I ask you to be. I can put you on my list. Right? I will write down the gentleman with the microphone. Yeah. And. Heike,
should I? Okay. Heike Jöpkes from the HTW Berlin. I have a very quick first question to Hansjörg. I mean, you ended with a nice quote. Intellectually, we are very pessimistic, or you are very pessimistic, but regarding your will, you're optimistic. But I mean, what would have to happen? Do we have? I mean, I like that you're optimistic, but given what you presented and given what we discussed on this conference, we rather had more and more obstacles. So what would have to happen on the global level for better development? I have another question to Dalia Marin. I generally like your hypothesis, and I also think this is really something threatening us, and at least education in the old style that we've done so far, just increasing the amount of people going to universities, will not be enough to deal with digitalization, with technical change and technological change and so on. Yet I was wondering how you could draw so strong conclusions about what is already happening, because the studies I know is that we have very little in the data, and I was also wondering when you presented your regressions, I had the feeling that your second picture on the right-hand side with the regression line was very much driven by one or two outliers. So I found your conclusions rather strong given the data we have. Plus, I thought sometimes one might also consider other explanations. Oh, sorry, yeah. Just coming quickly to the question, do we see successful reshoring since the financial crisis? Is that really only robots? Because I just know the surveys for Germany, and there, up to the financial crisis, we had a lot of reshoring just because companies who went to low-wage Eastern European countries realized they had underestimated other costs, like administration, infrastructure, and so on. So I would suggest that with the financial crisis, these other costs have increased due to banking system being very much driven by foreign companies and so on. So should one not consider other explanations for the reshoring? Is it really only successful reshoring, or is it just driven by more problems in low-wage Eastern countries? Because also the surveys show that, shoring off to China has other reasons.
Okay, so sorry to shoot you short. We're running out of time. So I'll take this young man here, then Philip, then the man's who's so resourceful to get his hands on a microphone should be rewarded for that. And then we have to really stop, I'm afraid. I know there are lots of other people who would like this year.
Thank you for all presentations. My name is Mateus, and I have a question for Bowles. I thought your charts of years of democracy really interesting. Thus, I would like to know what concept of democracy did you use? For example, Chile used to be considered a democracy of more than 100 years, but when they elected a socialist president, US solved it with guns and Chicago boys.
Philip Arestis, Cambridge University. Could I have a question for our first speaker here?
Is the microphone working? Oh, yeah.
Hello? Is that okay? Is it okay now?
No.
Oh, yes, much better. Do you think that enhancing the strength of trade unions and also increasing the minimum wage would reduce inequality in developing countries? Two examples. Between 1945 and the end of the 1970s, there were similar policies which did reduce inequality substantially, as Atkinson in his 2016 book suggests. Unfortunately, he died later. Also, there is another example, Brazil, during the President Lula's administration. So we do have examples that could be very powerful. Thank you.
So, please, yeah.
Luiz Carlos Bresser Pereira, Getúlio Vargas Foundation, São Paulo. To Mr. Bowles, Sam Bowles. Your presentation is a presentation that I think Americans understand better than any others because of the word liberalism. Liberalism in the United States has a different sense than it has in Europe or in Latin America. Liberalism was a very progressive ideology in the beginning of the 19th century and turned conservative since socialism began to rise. And this resulted in social democracy in Europe. But in the United States, this didn't happen, either because the socialist movement was not so strong or because repression was immense after the First World War. But what is important is that, in the case of the United States, is that while here in Europe, the capitalism was made more reasonable due to social democracy. In your case, what made capitalism more reasonable was another ideology, was republicanism, classical republicanism. And the formation of the United States, the founding fathers, they had a very strong republican aspect besides the liberal. And what happened since I'm closing? Yeah. And what happened since the 70s was this enormous change and the abandon. And why? Because liberalism turned into individualism and completely in opposition to republicanism, certainly to social democracy.
Okay, thank you, great. I'm sorry to cut people off. I know there's other people who want to take the floor, but I'm going to give now each of the speakers about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we have to wrap up. Maybe in the original order. Hansjörg, would you like to start?
Thank you for the questions. To Heike, it does not look like that, let's say, a new type of globalization can be established. It does not look like really. Yeah? However, we are living in a very dynamic time, and very, very quick changes are possible. And just to give one argument, it looks like now that the world economy develops in a good way, but maybe in 2 years we may have the next deep crisis, and we may have very, very fast also political developments, and of course we don't know in which direction they go. However, I feel that we here can contribute to the future in the way that we at least discuss important points and have certain ideas what could be done. So I think that that's an important function that we can do as intellectuals to contribute to potential future developments. To Philip, yes, of course, trade unions are very, very important. There's a very close relationship between union density and wage dispersion. Unions are very, very important, as well as minimum wages. And to come back to Tom, in many developing countries, we have no free unions, or we have purely firm-based wage negotiations. So there are also a lot of political problems, but this is an important element to change inequality also in developing countries.
Okay.
It's on.
It's on, yeah. To the question of the decline, okay, maybe I go in the reverse. The first one was about, I'm taking very strong conclusions, but in the figure there was some outlier maybe driving the results. I can assure you that when we run the regressions and using fixed effects, these results are completely robust. Yeah? The robustness comes for after the financial crisis, because it's in the figure. This is actually also a fixed effects regression. It's not, so even if we take out the one observation that was sort of on the line, it wasn't changing the results. Then you argued that there might be other things driving reshoring rather than robots. Yeah, it might be the case, but because we have industry fixed effects, that may be controlled by it. Actually, I have to say that the results that I showed are the very first results that we have been getting. We didn't have the best data for the wages that were completely in accordance with the classification we used for the other sectors. We will get this data in December and we will rerun it, but when we include wages, which are an important driver, wage differentials between home and host countries, which are an important driver of offshoring, we should have that in the regressions. We do have that when you look at the slides. The results are robust. Basically, reshoring is a robust phenomenon after the financial crisis. There are other things that might drive it, but this is robust. The skill premium, the decline in the skill premium driven by the public sector. I think in Germany, for example, this is an important part of the story. The decline in the skill premium was driven by the public sector. It's less the case, for instance, for Spain, where the public sector had seen a very strong rise in the wages before the financial crisis. So the public sector is, in some countries, maybe part of the story, but it's not an exclusive story. And then lastly, to education as a solution, I wasn't 100% understanding your point. Can you please repeat it?
Yeah, my answer is, your argument is that when the solution may not be the increase of education.
Yeah.
But education, higher education mainly, can delay the entrance of new workers in the labor market. In this sense, the increasing the time of education can actually be a social answer to this issue. Because then workers will work for shorter years, and then this could balance the relation between capital owners and workers. This is my question.
I see.
So maybe it's not an individual solution, but it's a social solution.
I mean, usually people say, when we have a big recession, then students say, okay, I'm going to go for a PhD, because if I go now on the labor market, I'm not going to get the job. And then many studies show, actually, when I go on the labor market in a recession, what happens is that I will get a low wage, and this low wage will be there forever. There is a very persistent effect of the first wage you get in your labor contract on your wage profile over a life cycle. That has been shown. So it might make sense for somebody to delay to go on the labor market when there is a recession. As a global solution, I don't think so.
Thank you very much. So, Sam, please.
Just a comment on what you said, Dahlia. I think if we're concerned about the Gini coefficient, to the extent that we are, the best thing that could happen would be to reduce the tertiary education premium. That is, a wage premium for higher ed is one of the main sources of inequality in the economy. Anything that drives that down is good for the Gini coefficient. I know that's not happy news in this room, but one of the reasons why some East Asian countries remained so egalitarian for so long was because they had a very rapid expansion of primary and then secondary schooling, and that kept the rate of return to education low. So having a low rate of return to schooling is an essential part of an egalitarian strategy, and it should be actively pushed.
I do disagree, actually.
I didn't say this suspecting that you would agree. The definition of democracy is rather standard. It includes the standard civil liberties as well as elections which are both inclusive and decisive, so that almost everybody can vote, and parties that lose elections leave office. That's the standard that we used. There are definitions of democracy which really have to do with representation of some kind of representative body like a parliament and so on, according to which Chile, also South Africa under apartheid and so on, have been called democratic, but obviously that is not part of the current definition of democracy, an exclusive franchise. Finally, I'm quite aware of the fact that the word liberal in America means left of center. I was not using the word in that sense. The fact that I happen to have an American accent doesn't mean that I'm innocent of the fact that there is a liberal tradition, which is a very important one in philosophy and political thought. That's what I was referring to. But I'd like to say that I think that that liberal tradition, meaning in the liberal philosophical and political tradition, has given much of the moral weight that we attribute to the social democratic movements. That is, much of what those movements are attempting to achieve is what the early writers of liberalism also were intending to promote. And I think to neglect that or ignore it is a mistake of the history of philosophy and political theory. It's also a political mistake, because it means we essentially end up criticizing people who we should be allied with on these particular issues, not on other issues on which we, of course, disagree. In saying this, I want to end by saying that I don't think advocating or defending, expanding social democracy is sufficient. I think that particular model was strongly statist in its orientation. It proposed that states solve problems that markets fail to solve through essentially Keynesian policies and also Pigou, Marshall-type policies and so on. I think what people are missing, and this is my assessment of what's going on in many countries, they're missing a sense of a vibrant civil society in which we have alternative forms of organization and associations such as trade unions, neighborhood organizations, workplace councils, and so on. These things were not part of the Keynes social democratic tradition, which I think, by the data which I showed, made fantastic gains for the countries in which it occurred. I think today we have to go on and recognize that working people need a voice in the places where they work, and the economic power in the economy has to also be accountable. That has not only not been part of the social democratic tradition, it has been actively hostile to workplace democracy, and I think that's a big mistake, and we should correct it.
So, thank you very much for that final appeal. First, we can have a round of applause for the whole panel now, and then I can wrap up the session. Thanks to all the colleagues who've spoken now on the final panel. Let me wrap up. It's a sort of pleasure, or also a duty, depending how you look at it, to close the conference now. So this was the 21st FMM conference. I hope you agree that at least this year we picked an interesting topic. We will certainly consider ecological topics and other topics for the next conference. Let me tell you, in case you haven't noticed it already, jostling your way to buffets and things, we've never had as high attendance as we had at this conference, and never had so many young people here attending the conference, so it's been a big success from that front. We've also launched an FMM Fellow initiative, starting with some networking at the start of this conference. We hope to keep you posted about that, and hope to be churning out some working papers, FMM Working Paper Fellow series, which I hope you'll follow also on the IMK website and get informed about that. We will have a 22nd FMM conference. You can already note the date, 25th to 27th of October 2018. So there are some aspects of university life which may be sort of rationalized away or replaced by robots, but I guess attending conferences like this is not one that robots can usefully do. So I hope to see many of you at next year's conference.